So discuss explanations for conformity, refer to Steph and Jess in your discussion. So the key words in this question are, of course, discussing explanations for conformity. A number of you in your essays focused solely on types of conformity, and you focused on compliance, identification, internalization, etc., which was relevant, but it's not an explanation for conformity, it's a type of conformity. So you couldn't get in the upper mark bands just discussing the types of conformity. And then, of course, the application element. So to refer to Steph and Jess in your discussion. So you really actually need to make mention of their names and how that relates to the explanations for conformity. So, of course, the explanations of conformity are normative social influence and informational social influence. You can, of course, after writing it once, then refer to it from NSI and ISI later on, as you'll see that I have done in this plan. So normative social influence is a form of compliance where there is public agreement with the group, but not necessarily private agreement, and a lot of you made that point. The main motivation to conform in normative social influence is the need to be liked, to gain social approval and to be accepted, liked, to fit in, to avoid rejection and ridicule, etc. And here for AO1, you could have spoken about Ash, although most of you did that as part of your evaluation. But the key here is that people conform due to normative social influence when there's a need to be liked by the group or a need to not be rejected by the group. On the other hand, informational social influence occurs when the individual is unsure how to behave and believes the group has more knowledge or expertise. And of course, this often takes place when the situation is ambiguous. So when there isn't a clearly defined correct answer, then this is where we tend to have informational social influence if the person believes that others are more knowledgeable than they are. It typically involves internalization, where public behaviour and private internal acceptance match. So this is where people truly do believe in the opinions of the majority, and they start genuinely believing it. So they're not just acting out of compliance, where they might publicly agree and their behaviours might reflect in public the beliefs of the group, but in private don't. With internalization, there's consistency between their public behaviour and their private acceptance or their private beliefs. The main motivation for informational social influence is the need to be right. People do this because they want to be correct. And here you could use a number of examples as well. You could use Sheriff or Janice for examples. For the application for AO2, you need to refer to Jeff and Steph specifically. So here you need to make mention that Jeff provides an example of normative social influence. And remember, with application questions, it's always really good to actually refer specifically to quotes or keywords that are in the scenario. So that will help you really ensure that you're applying your knowledge to the scenario. So Jeff displayed conformity probably due to normative social influence because he said he didn't want to be the odd one out, suggesting that his motivation is purely just to be accepted and to avoid rejection by the other teachers. Jeff's behaviour is likely to be temporary, and therefore it's likely that he's displaying the type of conformity known as compliance. He's just going along with the group just so he doesn't feel left out and just so the group doesn't reject him, but he doesn't genuinely believe that the teachers should be striking. Steph, on the other hand, is conforming probably due to informational social influence. Steph says that she's now quite passionate, suggesting that there is a relatively permanent change in attitude and behaviour, which would suggest internalisation. A number of you actually said that Steph was displaying identification, but the fact that there's evidence that there's a permanent change in behaviour shows that it's most likely internalisation. So the two key types of conformity you should be discussing is compliance with Jeff and internalisation with Steph. Now, I should say at this point that a number of you didn't mention normative or informational social influence and just focused on the types of conformity, compliance, and internalisation. You can see how closely they're linked, but as I was saying, the question specifically asks you to discuss explanations for conformity. So as you'll see in the mark scheme in just a moment, you do get some marks for discussing compliance and internalisation, but it's not enough because it doesn't address the question fully. So this is your AO1, and then your AO2 application. Let's move on now to AO3. Let's look at the evaluation. So because this question says discuss, that means that you do in fact have to provide evaluations, and we know that you should be providing about 4 to 5, if not more, really good, well-developed pure paragraphs. So let's have a look. We've got 5 paragraphs here, 3 supportive and 3 perhaps contradictory, or 3 paragraphs that show the limitations of using informational and normative social influence as explanations for conformity. So let's have a look here. There is supportive research for informational social influence by Jennis. Here's your point. So Jennis, you'll remember, studied the estimates of jelly beans by people privately, and then they were asked to discuss this in a group, and then they would get asked to provide another private estimate afterwards. What they found was that the second private answer after the group discussion converged closer to the group estimate. So afterwards, people tended to change their answer so it was closer to what the group estimated. This suggests that participants were looking to the group for the right answer, given the ambiguity of the situation. So there was no way of knowing how many jelly beans were in the jar. There was no correct answer, but people generally conformed to the group because they believed that the group estimate was more correct than their own. So this provides support for informational social influence as an explanation for conformity. Our next supportive peel paragraph. So supportive research for informational social influence is provided by Lucas this time. Lucas's experiment, of course, was involving students who were given either difficult or easy maths problems, and they found that greater conformity was observed for difficult questions. So the more difficult maths questions resulted in more conformity. Conformity was greater for participants, particularly who rated their maths ability as poor. So this tells us that participants conformed, particularly the ones who thought they were bad at maths, because they believed that others were more knowledgeable than themselves. And we know that, of course, conforming for that reason is informational social influence. So I'll link there. This provides support for informational social influence as an explanation for conformity. And our final supportive paragraph here. There is, of course, research by Ash to support the idea of normative social influence. So here a very quick outline of Ash's experiment, which you should know expertly. So participants were given a line comparison tasks. Participants conformed on 32% of trials and 75% conformed at least once. Now this is the important part here that many of you in fact left off in your discussion. So participants stated after the fact, after the experiment, that they did indeed know the correct answer. They just answered incorrectly to avoid rejection from the group. That's key because that element is what provides supportive evidence for normative social influence. So the fact that they knew that they were providing the incorrect answer meant that it wasn't informational social influence. It wasn't about being right because they knew that they were right. This was about avoiding rejection from the group. So this provides support for normative social influence as an explanation for conformity. Now we move on to our 2 opposing paragraphs, suggesting that there are limitations to using normative and informational social influence as explanations for conformity. So here our point is that there are individual differences in the effect of informational social influence. So individuals react differently to informational social influence. So there is research evidence by Ash initially, this first sentence here, in a variation of his experiment. He found that students were less conforming than other age groups, so 28% versus 37%. And there's also evidence by McGee and Sivan, who found that N-affiliators, these are people who have a greater need for being in a relationship and being around others, were more likely to conform due to normative social influence. So this suggests that informational social influence and normative social influence do not affect people in the same way. There are individual differences in conformity and explanations as to why people conform. And we know, of course, and this limits the validity of these as explanations for conformity. They're limited. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We can't use this to explain conformity in all people. And finally, our final limitation is that it's often difficult to distinguish between informational and normative social influence because they co-occur. So in variations of Ash's experiment, where participants were provided with a dissenter, remember a dissenter is a person who goes against the group. So this is somebody who's providing support to the participant in saying the correct answer. There were reduced conformity rates. Now this has been observed, but it's not entirely clear why this is. It's been argued that it could be due to informational social influence in that it provides an alternative source of information for the person, so therefore they're conforming in order to be right. Or it could provide support for normative social influence. So this person provides social support for the person, and so that they don't feel so rejected by the group when they go against their answer. This then suggests that actually both processes are usually involved in influencing conformity, and it's difficult to actually distinguish between one or the other, as they're both likely to occur at the same time. So finally, this limits the validity of normative and informational social influence as an explanation for conformity. So you can see there a bit of a guide to that essay. Some people did really, really well. Some people didn't do any evaluation, and some people's application needs work as well. So make sure that you really carefully read through your essay and see which areas you are lacking in and which areas you need to improve.